how you were going to die, how would you live your life differently?
Bill, one of the best characters in video game history, for me at least. Bill, as you'll already know, is part of the original group of Left 4 Dead 1 survivors. I grew up on these characters: Francis, Zoe, Lewis, and Bill, each of them incredible. Though at the time I played Left 4 Dead 1, they had very little dialogue, if any. So although they wouldn't really talk, a lot of their cut voice lines were added back in 2020 with the release of the Last Stand update, allowing myself to once again relate to these characters and properly understand their stories. Bill obviously doesn't make it, and that really hit hard for me the first time I played it. I always wondered, what if? What if things were different? In this video, I want to take a look at the ending of the sacrifice and ask the question, what if Bill survived the sacrifice? In order to answer that question, I have to properly analyze the ending, give my own theory on how he could survive through an alternate ending, and what that'd mean for the rest of the story. But before we get into that, if you enjoy what I do here, please consider subscribing. A very small percentage of people who watch these videos are actually subscribed, and it'd go a long way. While you're at it, consider liking the video as well. I always post bunny pictures on my post tab whenever a video hits 1,000 likes. I've been putting a lot of effort into these videos, this one in particular, so thank you if you decide to do so. Apologies for the interruption, let's jump back to the video. Before I even begin to describe my alternate ending, we first need to take a look at what actually happens at the end of the sacrifice, making sure we put an emphasis on the lesser known details. If you already know what happens, you can use the timestamps below to skip this section. However, I recommend watching it because I'll get into some pretty important character arcs. The meat of the story actually comes from the sacrifice comic. The comic dives into themes we otherwise wouldn't have gotten through the game because of things like time constraints or gameplay reasons. One of the important themes the comic conveys is looking out for your own. This theme is primarily touched on in the final 2 chapters. If you haven't read the Sacrifice comic, don't worry. All you really need to know up until this point is that our survivors got transported to this military facility, and through an altercation with the military, it got overrun, forcing our survivors to head towards a train to make an escape. It begins with the train sequence. After starting up the train, some of the survivors from the outpost try to get on, but due to the speed of the train and the hordes of infected, none of them end up making it. This scene is what sparks the disagreement between Zoe and Bill that you can sometimes hear at the start of the Sacrifice campaign.
End of the line, sweeties. Grab some gear and let's go.
Great! Maybe we can meet some new people and leave them behind.
Zoe, I'm not leaving any of you behind.
Bill directly refuses to stop the train and word for word says, "No, we look after our own." Zoe argues with him inside the train, trying to make the point that there are more carriers out there, that they shouldn't just run off to some island and hide, that they need to fight back, that they need to find other carriers like them and form some type of resistance. Bill contradicts her, explaining that they've been fighting non-stop and that the only reason they're still alive is luck. Bill says he's tried Zoe's way and from here on out they only look out for their own. This part is extremely important in understanding Zoe's character arc, so remember this moment. In the following chapter, we get a glimpse into Bill's past in order to provide some sort of explanation on why he thinks the way he thinks. 2 days after the first infection, we see Bill sitting in a veterans hospital. A nurse comes up to him and asks if he's expecting any family. Bill doesn't say anything back. He just merely stares at the doctor. Although no words were said at this moment, this interaction is extremely powerful. It shows us one of his most vulnerable moments. Directly after this sequence, Bill is put under some sort of anesthesia, but before he can fully succumb to his medication, an infected busts into the operating room, killing the doctors. Bill struggles through the hospital but eventually makes his way back home, where we see he's held on to his old Vietnam uniform, alongside a picture that shows who I'd assume were his friends. This scene is put back to back with the previous one I mentioned, and that's no mere coincidence. Both of these snippets show Bill putting his trust in someone and the outcome always failing. This time, there's no turning back. He takes one last look at his picture and throws on his beret. He slings his gun over his shoulder and steps out of the apartment, guns blazing. Jumping ahead in time, after they arrive in the city, they begin to wander the streets. Zoe asks Francis about Bill, and while Francis doesn't like arguing, he mentions that while Bill might not always do the right thing, he does it for the right reasons. A couple minutes later, they stumble across the sailboat we see near the bridge in the actual game. This is where we finally figure out how Bill's death plays out. The sail is too big to fit under the bridge, so in order to pass, they must raise the bridge. Bill notes this and figures that moving the bridge probably generates a ton of noise. This is where the comic directly ties into the game. Our survivors fight off the horde of infected, and as they turn on the generator, the bridge gets stuck on its way up. For a moment, all hope is lost. A massive horde pummels towards the bridge, with 3 or 4 tanks ramming their way through the infected. Side note, in the comic, Francis says there's 4 tanks, but in the trailer it only shows 3. The game can also spawn 4 tanks, which I thought is interesting. It's a little weird, but it's nothing crazy. With that discrepancy aside, Bill wastes no time. He jumps off the bridge, shouting at the other survivors to cover him. He tosses a Molotov at the tanks, drawing their attention, all while firing at the horde. He makes his way down to the generators and slams his thumb down on the button, starting it up again. For a moment, there's hope, but just as Bill looks back towards the bridge, he's slammed by a tank and is thrown into a nearby room. Blood spilling everywhere, he takes out his cigarettes and lights up one last time. Back on the bridge, Francis begs to go down after him, but Zoe interjects, explaining if he goes down now, Bill's sacrifice would have been for nothing. The final words out of Zoe's mouth are the same ones Bill used: "We look after our own." And with that, the sacrifice comic is concluded. Because of Bill's sacrifice, they're able to take the boat and presumably live the rest of their lives on a remote island. With the narrative version of the sacrifice out of the way, I can explain a few discrepancies between the game and the comic. I mentioned the number of tanks earlier, but if you've ever played the game before, whoever goes down to the generator dies right there. They don't get thrown into some sort of side room. We do find Bill's body in the room by playing the passing, but for gameplay reasons, there's no in-game cutscene showing Bill getting thrown into the room like he does in the comic. Now that you have all the important character arcs and general story details, let's jump into my what if. I have 2 alternate endings, so let's go through both of them. The part where this first alternate ending begins to change the canon is on the bridge sequence. Our survivors get on top of the bridge like normal, and one of the survivors heads down to the generator to start it up. It works, allowing them to head back and raise the bridge the rest of the way. Normally, the bridge would get stuck here, but instead, the magical powers of the world prevent this from happening. The generator doesn't stall, allowing the bridge to get raised all the way up with our 4 survivors safe and sound. However, there's a problem. In the game, the horde of infected kinda just stops after you turn on the generator and die, but in the comic, Bill is depicted to draw their attention away from the bridge long enough for it to stop making noise. So if Bill's no longer drawing the horde's attention away from the bridge, can our survivors fend off the rest of the infected? Personally, I think they can. To test this theory, I set the game's difficulty to normal, which I believe is the canon difficulty, and while you're on the bridge, try to fend them off for as long as possible. It's actually not that hard. With a couple of good Molotovs, our survivors could evade the tanks long enough for them to die and kill the remaining parts of the horde. In this ending, our survivors presumably kill all the infected in the area, or at the very least, enough infected to get down to the boat. If you've ever played the passing, you know the reason the Left 4 Dead 1 survivors are still around is because they're waiting for Lewis's leg to heal. This alternate ending doesn't change that fact. If Bill were to survive, you would see him standing on the bridge alongside Zoe, Francis, and Lewis when you get to the final chapter of the passing. After Lewis's leg heals, they would take the boat and journey off to the Keys just as they did in the comics, only with Bill by their side. Now let's talk about my second alternate ending. This ending takes place slightly after the bridge sequence. Our survivors start up the generator, but this time it stalls, like in the actual ending. Bill still jumps down in an attempt to sacrifice himself, but where this ending changes is when he goes down to restart the generator. Instead of getting beaten by a tank, Bill finds himself lucky, with enough time to run away. He uses the nearby building for cover as the tanks throw rocks at him. He mows down any infected that try to stop him, before eventually making his way through all all the buildings and finding a room suitable to hold out in. If he's smart, while he's running, he would have been throwing Molotovs at his feet, burning the infected, and lighting up any tanks following him. If he ran long enough, hopefully most, if not all, the infected following him would be dead, allowing him to live on, theoretically. But what would Zoe, Francis, and Lewis see? Well, from their perspective, not much would change. They'd see Bill run into the nearby room as the infected chase after him. In their minds, he's dead. But don't Zoe, Francis, and Lewis stick around longer? Yes, like I mentioned earlier, they wait for Lewis's leg to heal before taking off in the sailboat. This is where this ending kind of splits in two. The first option is what I call the happy ending, where Bill makes his way back to the group before they ever leave. It's possible he's out there long enough to see the second group of survivors pass through at the end of the passing, in which he decides to join them, helping them lower the bridge. Keep in mind the Left 4 Dead 1 survivors move the boat to the other side of the bridge before the second group comes. I could see Bill being hesitant to help them, as he just risked his life in this alternate scenario, but with some explanation, I'm sure he'd understand. After meeting with the second group of survivors, he's able to make his way back to the bridge and reunite with his group. Zoe, Francis, and Lewis all breathe a sigh of relief as they realize Bill's not actually dead. The rest of the passing plays out like normal. The second group of survivors successfully lower the bridge and use Jimmy Gibbs' race car to escape, leaving the other group to wait for Lewis's leg to heal and then finally sailing off to the Keys. Everyone survives, everyone's happy. In the second option for this alternate ending, Bill never meets with the second group of survivors. Instead, he hides away in whatever place he chose to hold out in. The passing plays out exactly as it does, the second group leaves, and the first group heads off to the Keys after waiting for Lewis's leg. Just like in the Canon ending. They all believe Bill's dead, leaving him behind. From here, Bill's story is pretty much a mystery. He could die later or survive long enough for the third installment. Given these two, or technically three endings because the second one is split, which of these two endings would I have preferred to see? I personally like the very last one where Bill's able to survive but they end up leaving him still thinking he's dead. He sacrificed himself while at the same time not actually dying. You could push back on this ending, pointing out that what's the point of him dying after this alternate ending? Wouldn't it not change anything? And you'd be correct, but the reason I chose this as my favorite is because of his potential to re-enter the story later on. Years down the line, he could meet back up with the Left 4 Dead 1 group. How would that affect them? Would there be any conflict? I feel like there's so many different ways they could take the story if they went down this route. Unfortunately, I hate to point out the obvious, but whether or not we get the third game would be important for this to pay off. If they never go on to make the third game, it essentially end on a cliffhanger, which would be less than ideal. Let's entertain the idea that Bill gets to live on in some alternate universe. He could become this special agent slash lone wolf archetype, going from city to city, surviving on his own by laying low. He might even attempt to find another boat and chase after the rest of the survivors. If I was Valve and went with this alternate ending, I would 100% greenlight a spin-off game revolving around his story after surviving. Sure, Left 4 Dead is about sticking together, but I'd love to see a spin on the solo gameplay. Could it even be done? Let's suspend our disbelief for a second. There's the possibility of him trying to meet back up with the other survivors, like I mentioned earlier. Bill could arrive at the island and realize they're gone, realize that something had to have happened. This spin-off could follow his adventure as he tries to solve this mystery. You could also have him get picked up by the military, and we follow his journey from there. There's a theory out there that the military is trying to train an army of carriers. We could see Bill being placed in this program, showing us the current state of not only the military, but what the front lines look like. There's so many different ways they could take it. Now that you properly understand what alternate ending I'd go with and have a general idea of the character arcs, mainly Zoe's, let's get into how this would affect their arcs. Zoe's entire character arc revolves around Bill's sacrifice. So if you go with an ending where she knows he's alive, she won't complete that arc. Remember that back on the train, Bill and Zoe were butting heads, fighting for their ideology. Zoe has the stance that they need to fight, that they need to push back no matter the cost. While Bill believes there's no point in that. He's put faith in one too many people, the military was the last straw. With Bill's death, Zoe basically absorbs his ideology, somewhat feeling like she failed, that only if she listened to Bill and looked out for her own, maybe he'd still be alive. Of course, as the audience, we know that's not technically true. There's nothing that they really could have done. And to an extent, Zoe even tries to convince herself. She knows that if they were to go down there and follow him, his sacrifice would have been for nothing. Yet she feels guilty. All of this character development is carried into the alternate ending. She still thinks he's dead, so nothing would really change in that regard. On the other hand, you have Bill, who survives, so of course his character arc would be different in some shape or form. In the comic, as Bill charges towards the horde of infected, he almost gives up in a way, knowing that saving his family as a final act of defiance is the only way to stick it to them. As he says, every time he thinks they're safe, that she's safe, they never stop coming. I could see his arc going in a few different directions. The first is that he realizes the importance of fighting back and resisting while also looking out for his own. The problem with Bill's ideology is that he's looking at it like it's black and white. He refuses to believe that running away to a remote island isn't just selfish, but cowardly. Some might say, how could you blame him? His entire life he's been putting faith in people that have constantly failed him. It's not his job to fix the world. It's his job to survive in it. I personally sympathize with Zoe's ideology more. If you've put your faith in the government and all these organizations fail you, it's now your responsibility to rise up to the occasion and resist. Because if you don't, no one else will, from their perspectives at least. Sure, we can bring up the fact that the military is still very much active and that they haven't fully fallen, but I'm arguing from an ideological standpoint more than a literal one. Now we have Francis and Lewis. Let's talk about Lewis. Lewis's character development for the most part is entirely static. His views never really change, unlike Zoe's, whose character development is way more dynamic. Does that mean Lewis isn't a well-written character? No, of course not. He stays optimistic the entire time, which keeps the group morale high during extremely dark and stressful times. His optimism is what keeps the group together despite any conflicts they might have. Francis, funnily enough, gets a bigger shift in his character arc. Up until this point, Francis has just been an asshole, always poking at people and making fun of them. However, through their adventures, he gains a deep level of admiration and respect for Bill. As they stand atop the bridge in the Sacrifice comic, Francis admits that Bill's the toughest old buzzard he's ever met, dropping his act entirely. I want to remind you that all these character arcs stay the same in this alternate ending, but now that we know where their character arcs currently stand, what if Bill were to come back years down the line? Would that mean more or less for these characters? It's up for you to decide. While I personally would have liked for Bill to survive, this alternate ending doesn't really need to happen. They end off Bill's character arc in a way that deeply impacts the other characters, and introducing him later down the line might take away from that development. But what do you think of my what if? Do you think I proposed any good ideas? I really hope you enjoyed the video. Consider leaving a like if you got all the way to the end, and subscribing if you want more content from me. That's all for today. Have a nice rest of your day. Peace out.